I know that fear doesn't necessarily give rise to good behaviours. You know, we're more likely to sort of go into self-protective mode if we're scared, rather than stop eating beef and flying and all that business. So I suspected, just from what I knew from psychology, that talking just about catastrophe wasn't going to get us there. It would get some people there, but just as many would be switch off, go into avoidance, denial. So I did some research to test that, and I've done it in lots of different domains, but focusing on fiction, I had, got hundreds of readers read short stories with a catastrophic basis and short stories with a solution focus, and the results were really clear. The catastrophic ones, they kind of inspired some to say action should be taken or we need to do something. It never inspired anyone to say, I will now do this. And just as many people switched off and said, they didn't like it, they felt manipulated, scared, whereas the positive ones, no one switched off from them. And it gave rise to the kinds of things, right, this character did this, I could do that. I'm now going to do this. So absolute definite, this has inspired me to change my ways. And I thought, my God, we've been doing this all wrong.
Welcome to the Stark Reflections on Writing and Publishing podcast. There has never been a better time for writers. More information, options, and opportunities are available to you, but navigating these requires insight. Join Mark Leslie Lefebvre as he draws upon more than a quarter century of experience as a writer, a bookseller, and a trusted book industry consultant to explore and reflect on the writing and publishing landscape to help you make informed choices on your writer journey.
Hello, Reflectives, and welcome to episode 304 of the Stark Reflections podcast. This is your host, Mark Leslie Lefebvre. In today's episode, I have an interview with Denise Baden, who's a professor of sustainable practice at the University of Southampton, UK. She's published widely in both the academia and fiction worlds. Her eco-themed rom-com, Habitat Man, was published in 2021, followed by The Assassin and No More Fairy Tales, Stories to Save the Planet in 2022. In 2018, Denise set up the Green Stories writing project that challenges writers to embed green solutions in their stories via a series of free writing competitions. These are open to all, and 17 competitions have been run so far, which have resulted in several publications and lots of great prize money. And that's an opportunity we're going to talk about later in the interview, so pay attention. There's a market you can send this to, and that deadline's going to be in June 2023. Now, Denise is listed on the Forbes list of climate leaders changing the film and TV industry, and she speaks regularly on how to write for a cause. We have a fantastic conversation that I know you're going to find inspiring, and that's coming up later in this episode. But first, let's hear a word about this episode's sponsor. This episode is sponsored by Findaway Voices. If you are looking at publishing an audiobook and you're not sure where to go, Findaway Voices has got you covered. Findaway Voices is a place where you can find an audiobook narrator. They have a platform called Voices Marketplace, and they have curated thousands of professional narrators around the world with different genres, different voices, different styles. You can sample, you can listen to them, you can find the right narrator for you. Or, if you've already done your own audiobook, you can leverage Findaway Voices for distribution. They can get your audiobook into more than 43 retail and library platforms around the world where you're in control. You can decide which ones you want to go to, but like me, why not go to them all? You can also set your price and control the price on the majority of those platforms. The pricing is a different structure for different retailers, different libraries. There's models like cost per checkout and one copy, one user. All kinds of different ways that people can access your audiobook through retailers and through libraries with different ways that you can make money. And I like having multiple streams of income, and I love the 43 retail and library platforms that Findaway Voices gives me access to, including Spotify, which owns Findaway Voices, and because of that, they've recently announced that they are removing a 20% access fee or distribution fee since it's owned by the same company. So that's more margin in your pocket. And if you want to see how you can leverage Findaway Voices as an author, either to create an audiobook or for the creation and distribution or for just the distribution of an audiobook, see, it's all in your hands. It's in your control. You can check them out over at starkreflections.ca/Findaway. And now for comments from recent episodes. Over at starkreflections.ca for episode 301, Procrastinating Partners Collaborating with Liz Anderson, Stanley B. Trice said, I enjoyed the interaction between you and Liz. You should do more podcasts together. Well, thank you for that, Stanley. I love interacting with Liz, and I think we have a great dynamic. Well, of course, we're partners in real life, not just partners on that episode. And we've had some fun collaborating on parody videos, as we talked about in that episode. Even honestly, it was so much fun when I got to be her Ed McMahon for the daily shows she was doing for the school when she was short of a VP, and so I was sort of that person, and maybe I can talk Liz into coming on and being that sort of co-host every once in a while to talk about things. Maybe potentially I'll reflect in a conversation rather than a monologue. So let me know. Cool idea, Stanley. And of course, Liz's schedule is pretty packed and pretty heavy, so I wouldn't be able to do that on a regular basis. But it would be interesting to have us both listen to an episode here and there and then just get those dual reflections. Let me know what you think about that idea. And thank you for that comment, Stanley. Now, over on the Twitter sphere, Edwin Downward said, for episode 302, which is Fat Vampires, Storytelling and Empathy with Johnny B. Truant, Edwin says, it turns out Mark Leslie's giving us a double header of Stark Reflections podcast this week. Oh yeah, Edwin, don't worry, there's more coming up because I have so many interviews in the queue, and I don't want to wait to put them all out there. That's why every once in a while I'm going to throw an extra episode in for you guys. Anyways, Edwin says, the first one has got me thinking about longevity as a writer. There were a lot of voices out there when I first heard about self-publishing, and so many of them have gone silent. But a few are still there going strong. On a personal level, it's instructive that I'm still here to remark upon that change. And I'm so glad that you did remark upon that change. And yes, Edwin, it is very instructive. Think about this. You've been around for a long time. You recognize the patience, practice, persistence, and the perseverance that are all critical for the longevity in writing. I know Johnny talked about that longevity. Joanna Penn talked about longevity. And I think it's really good for us to recognize that a lot of times that what's the old Rome was not built in a day, that it can take a long time. And your dedication and your commitment to toiling in the fields for the long run speak volumes, Edwin. So cool that you've been around for all of those changes. And then, of course, Edwin said for episode 303, writing as a second career with Lisa M. Lilly, Edwin said, second, Stark Reflections with Mark Leslie listened to, and today I'm thinking about how all of my writing has been done in the gaps of life. The concept of becoming a full-time writer, always something for the far future. I'm glad you commented on that, Edwin, because I think it is so important that there's no one way of doing things. You know, we often believe or think that, we have to desire to become a full-time writer. And I love that, Lisa. I love the fact that she recognized, no, there is fulfillment. There is a reward in and of itself in that day job. And so maybe working part-time at the day job. I mean, it's definitely a pleasure that I have enjoyed myself. And so we don't always have to aspire to do it like everyone else does, or there is no one way. There is no one way that you have to be a writer. You can be a part-time writer, and interesting. So maybe full-time writer is something that you want to do, and that can still be a goal, and there's nothing wrong with that, but there's also, of course, nothing wrong with writing on the side, part-time, whatever it is. I love the fact that as indie authors, we can make that decision for ourselves. And that is one of the most awesome things about, being, I say indie author, but just being an author in general, because no matter how you publish, you're still in control and you still get to make those decisions because you're technically a business owner, even if you are trying to sell it to a publisher, because, you're licensing that as a business person. Anyways, Yeah, maybe I'm just in the midst of taxes too much and I'm thinking too much like business. Just got off the phone with my accountant, so that's why it's in the back of my head. So thank you, Edwin. Thank you, Stanley. Thank you, everyone who leaves comments. I love to hear your reflections. When you share your reflections, it just reminds me that this is us thinking and learning and leaning in together, and that I love so much. I love knowing what you guys are thinking about as well, because that just helps me learn more, and it helps me reflect more. And I think the more that I learn and the more that I reflect, the better off I am. So really, it's just a selfish thing. Thanks for sharing those reflections. You can share your own reflections over at starkreflections.ca for any episode. You can share it over at Twitter at Mark Leslie. You can email me, mark@markleslie.ca. And of course, several patrons often share their comments over at patreon.com/starkreflections for the things that I post there, with the extra episodes, the extra audio, the extra bonuses that you get. And a huge, huge thank you to everyone who supports this podcast over at patreon.com/starkreflections. But that's it for the comments. I am going to waive the personal update. I'm in between projects. I just started it as Thursday, May 11th, as I'm recording this. And I'm going to be starting, I've just started my calendar for May 12th, the next projects, a couple projects I'm working on in parallel. Okay, I'll be honest, there's 5 or 6 projects I'm working on in parallel, but the more writing specific, like Mark writing stuff, a couple of those projects in parallel where I've got them dedicated in my calendar, so I'll be able to give some updates on that. But other than that, I want to get into this interview with Denise, and this is really interesting, and I wanted to connect this interview relatively close to Johnny's interview, which was in episode 302, and that was Johnny B. Truant, because Johnny talked about, both in that episode as well as in episode 300 with the guest voices, guest reflections, that importance of storytelling, and Denise demonstrates that in a very effective way, with thinking about sustainability and thinking about carbon neutrality and thinking about ecology and basically the environment in general. And she really takes that and shows us how she applies that in a way that works in story and allows people to think without being preachy and boring and academic, right? You can do really amazing things in story, and that's just a great conversation, and I know you're going to love it. And you know what else I know? I know that you're going to hear that conversation right after this bumper. Denise, welcome to the Stark Reflections podcast.
Thank you for inviting me on, Mark. I'm delighted to be here.
Well, I'm so looking forward to talking to you. Well, I'm doing it now, so I'm looking forward to the moment we're in, which is a great place to be. So let's get into your background. As a researcher, as an academic, I'm really curious to dig into that a little.
Yeah, sure. Well, I've had a fairly mixed background. So I've been out in the world of work. I was sold books for a while, so I've been on the other end.
Oh, you're a bookseller like me. We're cut from the same cloth.
I used to be a sales rep going around selling cookery books, so not quite the same thing. But
you would have sold to people like me in the bookstores, right?
Yeah, I would have. Yeah.
Which publisher were you working with?
I started off an Australian publisher.
Okay.
Oh my God, I can't remember their name now, but a blank. But because they got bought out by Mearhurst, and then I worked with a number of arty ones like Findaway, and I tend to pick up lots of small publishers.
Right. Yeah.
And go freelance, and so that worked out quite well, actually, quite fun.
Oh, it's fun. It's fun talking books with people, right?
Yeah, for sure.
All right, so that was one of the many hats you wore over the years. What else?
So let's see. I did a degree in politics and economics, went out in the world of work, came back to do a PhD in psychology, which really interested me. And then I ended up, I was inspired by a work of fiction to become a bit of a Greeny and climate activist. A
work of fiction, not like a nonfiction book or any of the heavy science stuff. It was what was the fiction book?
Are you familiar with Ben Elton?
I know the name.
Yeah, he was big in the 80s as a comic, and then he got very much into writing books and plays. He's moved to Australia now. He's so funny. But he did a book, Stark, it's a kind of thriller set in Australia. Okay. About this kind of attempt of all the rich people to kind of take off from Earth. And what he did, so it's a bit of a sort of a rom-com thriller thing. But in the middle of it, he'd have little green nuggets like he'd have a character like Dave, who was a water birth. And then you'd find out, that Dave died shortly after being born. And then you find out Dave's a dolphin because he wasn't in a tuna-friendly net. And
Oh my
I thought, hang on, I'm going to buy a dolphin-friendly tuna now. And it was my first hint that you could reach the mainstream audience. I would never have watched a green documentary or read an environmental book, but that really caught me. So I became a bit of a greenie. And then I ended up teaching in the area of sustainability. And then, academics, it's like, they're so pedantic and everything's got to be just so. And my nature isn't quite suited to that.
So you're the dolphin out of water in some of the academic institutions.
I love research, offer me a question. I think that's an empirical question. Let's do a study on it.
Yeah.
But there's this sort of making a black art out of everything, trying to make it sound more impressive than it is. I get really impatient with it. And also impatient with the quite small audience you get. If 10 people cite your work, you're a star.
Yeah.
And I kind of thought, I want a bigger platform. There's so much I kind of wanted to share and say. And I thought, well, I was influenced by fiction. So I kind of went off on a tangent. And now I don't know what to call myself: academic, climate activist, author. It depends on which day of the week it is and how well my writing's going.
Oh, I love that. So let's talk about some of the work that you do, because I'm so fascinated by this nature. I was just recently talking to a guest on the podcast, talking about how story is a really valuable way of expressing, going on the internet and arguing with someone with a difference of opinion. No one's going to change their mind. You're just going to get mad at each other and walk away, or storm away, or slam the virtual door, or whatever it is. But in a story, like you've just expressed, in a story, you can see something, a bit more empathy and open-mindedness, because you're often in the character's point of view, and suddenly understand something that in a scientific journal might have been too obtuse or too difficult to read. Or you put your walls up and immediately say, no, I believe this, therefore I'm never going to believe anything else. But fiction allows you a different way of seeing things, right?
You completely hit the nail on the head. And what the academics call that is narrative transportation.
Oh, I love that. Narrative transportation.
And it's this idea that when you're immersed in a story, you kind of take on the characters' opinions and feelings as your own. And it's a way you can kind of, exactly as you were saying, undermine or get through your defenses.
Right.
In quite a sort of subtle way. So, and also I think we remember information we come across in a story much better than we do perhaps if we come across it as dry facts, because it's attached to so much else that we can relate to.
Yeah, because it's part of a context rather than just a known thing, right?
Yeah.
Like mnemonic kind of way of remembering things.
That's right. And I think it's a technique that memory people do, is they attach let's say if they can remember an entire pack of cards, they connect it all to other things in their brain, tell a story about it, and that way they remember it. So, all ties in.
I love that. So fiction inspired you, and then obviously you did the study, you got involved, you did research, etc. How did you end up expressing all of these things that you were learning?
Well, one of the things is that I became quite worried about our climate crisis and the fact that we're all in our own echo chambers.
Yeah.
I knew I wanted to move into fiction, but then I thought, well, how can we do that well? And what was worrying me was that everyone was talking doom and gloom. And yeah, there are reasons to be frightened. But as a psychologist by background, I know that fear doesn't necessarily give rise to good behaviors.
Yeah.
We're more likely to sort of go into self-protective mode if we're scared, rather than stop eating beef and flying and all that business. So I suspected, just from what I knew from psychology, that talking just about catastrophe wasn't going to get us there. It would get some people there, but just as many would be switch off, go into avoidance, denial, all kind of prepper type responses.
Right.
So I did some research to test that, and I've done it in lots of different domains, but focusing on fiction, I had, hundreds of readers read short stories with a catastrophic basis and short stories with a solution focus. And the results were really clear. The catastrophic ones, they kind of inspired some to say action should be taken, or we need to do something. It never inspired anyone to say, I will now do this. And just as many people switched off and said, they didn't like it, they felt manipulated, scared, whereas the positive ones, no one switched off from them.
Really?
And it gave rise to the kinds of things, right, this character did this, I could do that. I'm now going to do this. So absolute definite, this has inspired me to change my ways. And I thought, my God, we've been doing this all wrong. It's changing now, but 5 years ago, almost all communications were very negative and doom-laden. Yeah. And climate fiction was entirely dystopian. And that's fine for people who like dystopias, but it's not going to engage a broader audience, the kind of broad audience you need, really.
Right. Wow. I love that. That is so fascinating. So you're a professor of sustainable practice at the University of Southampton. When you're doing the studies with your students, is it a combination of, articles, research, studies, but do you actually incorporate fiction into the class?
Tend not to, but I'm thinking about doing that a little bit more. So I do use my students as research subjects, and if I get a good result, I'll take it out into the broader public. But I think it would be nice. I use case studies.
Okay.
So I used to use case studies of business ethics scandals. And I discovered that one student thought I was teaching them how to be unethical to get ahead in business. It's like, that wasn't the point. And that's when I started thinking, hang on a minute. So I started doing case studies of more positive examples, and that had much more the desired effect. It kind of led into the research. And I guess that in turn kind of led me to think we need more stories out there that show positive examples of what we can do. Because I'm also worried about eco-anxiety. Yeah. Because I think you read this stuff and you just get scared, and it's like revving an engine while not being in gear. It's like tons of negative energy, but you're not going anywhere.
Which is the last 2 years for a lot of us, right?
Oh gosh, I know. And it's only going to get worse, because it's not like, other anxieties, it's very rational. And so I really wanted to take all that energy and harness it via stories into the kind of action that might be effective. But there was no stories doing that, which is why I set up the Green Stories project.
Yeah, so let's talk about the Green Stories project. Now, that's something that's open for other writers to participate in, right?
It is, yeah. It's I set it up in 2018, and I've had sponsorship from all kinds of people. We've managed to keep it going, and it's free to enter, as long as it's in English. And the goal is to really write a story that showcases positive examples of what a sustainable society might look like if we did it well. And there's lots of information on the website to help. Or to aim it, normal genre fiction, thriller, romance, but sort of smuggle in green solutions. And we've done short stories, flash fiction, novels, interactive fiction, screenplays, stage plays.
Wow.
So that kind of, it went well, but one of the problems was writers weren't addressing the criteria. And I ended up, because it's free, you get all kinds of drossing, quite frankly. I was trying to think of a polite way to say it. But it's any old thing. And because we were relying on voluntary judges and all this, it was a burden. And I didn't have anything to show them as an example. There's so few sort of stories that do that. Yeah. Which is why in the end I started writing myself. I thought, if you can't find it out there. And this was just before lockdown, actually. I had this guy, I was trying to make my garden wildlife friendly. And so there was this guy who'd given up his job to help make, to become a green garden consultant. And he came over and he told me that I didn't have to mow my lawn. It's better off for nature if I leave it long. It's like, result, got me a water butt. So I collect all rainwater, which really helps in the droughts. Put in a pond, native flowers to attract the pollinators and bees. And he was wonderful. And he said, I want to do this to the world. But, because our wildlife is so in jeopardy, but I can only do a few gardens. And I thought, hang on a minute, this would make a good story. So I sort of wrote Habitat Man, and except, he also falls in love. And when he's digging, he digs up a body. And then I can talk about natural burials. And,
Oh my goodness, yeah.
So it was a really fun way to kind of weave in lots of sort of green tips into a sort of rom-com with a hint of cozy mystery.
Oh wow, so it's rom-com, cozy mystery. So you've got like a bunch of genres that are very palatable, because obviously with rom-com you assume a happy ending. If you call that's the Shakespearean comedy or romance always has to end happily, right?
Yeah.
And then you throw in a bit of a mystery to give some intrigue.
Yeah.
But there's also the message that people are learning.
There is.
Oh, I love that.
It was really good fun to write. I thought, I just want to skip all the horrible statistics. Let's not bother with that. Let's focus just on what people can do and not even talk about. I don't think I mentioned climate barely in the whole thing. It just arises out of the plot, and it was such fun to write. And I learned to see things through the eyes of, worms and bees and butterflies and birds. Just from doing the research. And that was really, it's like opening up a whole new world when you do that. And I hope I managed to do that for the reader. That was the aim, to try and get them to see, when they look in their back garden, something completely different perhaps than what they did.
Yeah, but that wasn't enough, right? You wrote that one rom-com, and I guess you got a taste for it and wanted to. What was the next one that came out?
Well, someone approached me from Herculean Climate Solutions, wonderful name for a company.
Yeah.
And he said, I'm a chemical engineer and there's all these solutions I want to do and no one's interested. And I entered your green stories competition. I didn't win, grr. But why don't we do something? Why don't we team up experienced writers with climate experts to create an anthology? And let's do it in time for COP27, for the climate summit.
Wow.
In Egypt. And it's like, that's impossible. You've only given me 6 months. And he's like, well, so is the climate crisis. Let's do it anyway. And what I hadn't counted on was how many writers out there really cared and really wanted to use their voice for something good. So we had a real iterative thing where we'd kind of suggest some solutions, they'd suggest some stories, we to and fro with it.
Right.
Because we wanted it to be first and foremost entertaining.
Yeah.
And then have key solutions in it. And it was actually shared around COP27. We had 24 stories. I don't know if you know Kim Stanley Robinson, but he's
of course, yes,
big name.
Yeah.
Stan, as I now know him, proud to call him Stan. He was lovely. He gave us 3 chapters from his epic book, Ministry for the Future, that we could include.
Wow.
Paolo Bacigalupi, wonderful writer in the sort of eco-fiction, sort of sci-fi space. He gave us a standalone story. So, we got really, really lovely ones. Some were nature-based, some were very techy, some were romances. I wrote a whodunit about a citizens' jury where 8 people meet to debate climate solutions. And one of these is an assassin, so I got a whodunit there. It turned out not to be quite so short, so I kind of published that on its own as a...
Oh, that was the assassin. Oh,
yeah.
okay, all right.
And,
like a novella length probably, or something like that?
It is. It's about 17,000 words.
Okay.
I do want to develop it into a full book because I really cut everything trying to keep it a short story. Failed. Did it as a novella, but I've got so much more in my head to sort of deliver on that one, and backstory, and
wow.
Yeah, so it's been fun.
That's amazing. And so when you talked about like, so people could win, and that one gentleman, you went, I didn't win. What is it that they win? Is it some sort of publication? Is there?
Yeah, so with the next novel prize, for example, the deadline's 26th June. We got £1,000 or $1,200 for the first prize. Okay. $600 for the second prize. We're really keen, so it doesn't have to be completely finished, but we would like it to be pretty well first draft element, because we asked for 3 chapters and a synopsis, and if quite often when we get the finalists, we ask for a few more chapters to help us decide. And the goal is to get it published.
Oh,
Now,
wow.
if they've got connections and want to get it traditionally published, fine. But if not, quite happy to mentor them towards self-publication.
Oh, that's fantastic. So this is
Yeah.
just a prize just for writing something awesome, and then they can still license it to a publisher or do it themselves.
I mean, the whole goal is to get it out there. So if they can get further reach, doing it their way, fine. It's just anything we can do to help to get these books out there.
Oh my God, a good friend of mine writes eco thrillers, and I know she's working on the 5th book. And it's like, Sarah, you got to get this in. So is it open to writers from around the world then? Because she's a
Yes.
Canadian? Okay.
Yeah, as long as they're in English, that's the only
Yeah,
thing.
yeah, of course. Yeah. The Queen's English, or I should say the King's English.
Oh my word, yeah, that's coming up now. Coronation coming up. We're full of it over here.
So this is fantastic. I'm really curious about the response that you've gotten from the rom-com or even this anthology project, etc.
Yeah, so with Habitat Man, I actually did a bit of research with someone from the University of Utah, Emily Corrin, and also the English department at the University of Southampton here. And we asked 50 readers to read it. And we basically did surveys before, during, after, and then 1 month after.
Right.
And there's all kinds of solutions in there. So we listed them all and we asked them, has it raised your awareness? Is it something you now do that didn't? Is it something you'd recommend to others? And we found that 98% had adopted at least one green alternative.
Really?
Yeah, so I mean, obviously a lot of it was to do with gardening, home composting, avoiding pesticides. One of the things we talked about was flea treatment, because the heroine has a dog. And most people don't know that pet and flea treatments, don't just kill the fleas and worms,
Right.
And we got a side sort of character, the hero's best friend. She's his lesbian flatmate, and she sets up this random recipe generator where it automatically sort of gives you a list of seasonal low carbon foods, and always with one joker ingredient, like it could be inedible insects or nettles, and you have to cook something just based on those ingredients. And it becomes a viral cookery challenge called This Tastes Absolutely Disgusting. But it's kind of a fun way to introduce people to sort of low carbon foods. And that, a lot of people said they were much more aware of, the importance of seasonal vegetables. And I haven't got anyone eating edible insects yet, though.
Yes.
My hero has a revelation, a turning point. So I think, well, let's have it in a composting toilet. Perfect metaphor for the circular economy. And a lot of people said, I'm really interested in this composting toilet. So my character, the Wizard of Woolston, gets a pond to attract frogs and bats. So that's another thing that people quite like. The natural burial. A lot of people wrote to me actually saying, I love the natural burial scene. I've now changed my will to have a natural burial. So that was
something you can do in a public. You don't need to be,
it's really, people don't realize just how much you can do yourself. You can do it in your own back garden. You just have to register it on the house deeds, and you have to. I don't think you can be too near a sort of public water thing or anything like that. But
of course, and it's got to be 6 feet or so down, so it's not.
No, actually, it doesn't. So
I thought maybe erosion and stuff. You're gonna have a surprise in the backyard.
Actually, well, in terms of
I've seen the movie Poltergeist.
Oh right, we're in a whole different terrain now. No, the more shallow the burial, the better.
Really?
Was when I've become a bit of an expert, I'm afraid.
Especially if you have a dog, because then the bones. I'm just kidding.
No, it's the way we do it, where we fill the body full of formaldehyde. I mean, because it kills bacteria.
Right.
It kills everything in the earth.
Oh my goodness. So they could use some other solution.
Well, you don't. You just let the earth go. You let anyone who's in mourning. You let the earth and the ecosystem do what it's designed to do and recycle.
Right. Oh no,
A lot of
that's because we are actually, except for things like that, or hip replacements and joint replacements, we're organic.
We are. So don't fill the body full of chemicals. Don't
Really?
put it in a hardwood coffin. Something like willow is really good for the
Because
environment.
willow will decompose a lot faster, right?
Yeah, it's cheap, it's easy to weave,
Oh,
it's
wow.
good for wildlife. Don't fill it full of chemicals. And the more shallow you bury it, the less methane you produce. So the deeper it goes, it can't, it can't use oxygen. So you get methane, which is a very potent
And I
greenhouse.
produce enough of that walking around every day, so.
You didn't think the conversation would go this way, did you?
No, I write macabre stuff, so I'm gonna go there. I'm gonna follow you to the dark corners.
Well, if we're going dark, I actually wrote that scene when my mum was dying. So there's a lot
Oh
of
my
love in it
goodness.
as well. And I used a willow coffin in natural burial myself. So
Really? So
this
you had to learn about that, obviously.
I did. And actually it made it kind of special. I think a little bit of extra emotion got in there that perhaps moved other people
Oh, of course, yeah.
when they were reading it. But it was such a lovely event in practice, and I think some of that joy made its way into the book. And you think, well, why would you fill it full of chemicals and hardwood? It's so disrespectful to the earth,
Well, when you think about the legacy that somebody leaves, right? The legacy that somebody leaves is emotional, and they live on in many, many ways. So why not allow the beauty of them nourishing the earth itself, giving back to Mother Earth who gave to us, right?
Exactly. And so I think if I'd say the one thing that people keep coming back to, it's that scene where they
Oh,
say,
wow. See, I'm looking at, well, you know what? Why not? Why waste money on an oak coffin and, all this stuff when, and formaldehyde and things like that, they're going to damage the earth when we can have a positive impact and feed the trees, feed the grass, feed the flowers, feed the insects.
Yes.
All the wow, there you go. So you have already inspired and motivated me in a positive way. Wow, thank you for this. So do you have any tips for writers who would be interested in writing fiction that helps inspire and inform people in positive ways about, you called it being a greenie? Is that what you called it?
I called it being a greenie, yeah.
I like that, yeah.
Yeah, so the website greenstories.org.uk has got loads and loads of tips. I do talks and things like that as well. But I think the key point is you have to be very careful not to overload it with information, and to remember everything that happens, every bit of information should arise organically out of the plot, out of the characters.
Right.
If your readers wanted a lecture, they'd have read nonfiction.
Right.
So that's quite hard to do. So sometimes you've just got to write it out of your system and and then edit it back out.
Yeah, I love that. It's just, naturally part of the story, not banging someone over the head in any
I also think the anthology which I compiled, No More Fairy Tales, Stories to Save Our Planet, there's loads of different writers taking very different approaches there. So it's actually quite a nice source book to get a sense of how you can integrate these kinds of topics in different kinds of stories. Some are funny, some are tragic, some are action-packed, some are more legal, some are, mine's a whodunit. So have a look what's out there. I set up an imprint, Habitat Press, which kind of is to support the Green Stories project. And there's some nice books there to have a look at. And hopefully the next Green Stories winner will find their book on there. And so you could be part of that sort of community. And I think the competitions that we run, even I find they're quite good as a deadline. So you think, I want to write this, but I could do it tomorrow. If you've got a deadline of a competition, I think that can be quite handy. And we hold them regularly. So we've had about 17, I think, since 2018. I keep thinking it's going to be the last one, and then another sponsor will come.
Oh, wow, that's fantastic. Yeah, there is nothing like that deadline to motivate a writer to get stuff done. So I know this is a bit of an aside, but it is related. In terms of, because this is a podcast for writers, what are some things that writers may not think about in their own practices as writers that they could do, not in their fiction or nonfiction or whatever, but in their behaviors as a writer? Are there certain practices that they may be able to incorporate to to be a bit more green?
Oh, just like how anyone can be more green.
Yeah. I mean, obviously, but I'm thinking, writers in particular. I mean, it's the type of coffee I drink, and
I think, well, one of the things is quite subtle, and I think as writers, your real power is what you put out there.
yeah,
And you don't have to put climate stuff in or green stuff in. Your attitude towards the place of humanity in our beautiful Mother Earth will come through.
right.
Yeah. So, for example, I mean, I'm often to be found shouting at the television.
You and me both.
And the last time I shouted at the television, we were watching sort of crime procedural. I don't think it's anything you get in the US, but it's this guy, and every week he solves a mystery. Yeah. But the overarching thing is his wife had disappeared mysteriously 9 years ago, and he's got to decide, is he going to write her off as dead?
Right.
And he decides he will. And so he goes to the car breakers to basically have her car broken up. And the car breaker says, well, this has got a lot of good miles in it. You sure you want to smash it up? And he's so delicate and emotional that, yeah, smash it up. And it's like, what disrespect. I agonized for ages thinking, can I, justify the embedded carbon in my new electric vehicle, or, do I not do enough miles? And he's just smashing it up. And it's like, that I'm thinking it's that completely oblivious sense, which is common. So I am not having a pop at people. We're taught to be utterly oblivious, really, of the relationship of what we do, what we consume, and the environment. And I think just a little bit of respect for what Mother Nature gives us and the fragile ecosystem it all depends on. Either you have that or you don't. And writing can subtly show that, or it can subtly, completely be oblivious of it.
And that reminds me of something we discussed prior to the recording starting. You showed me a really great graphic, and I hope I can share it at the show notes at starkreflections.ca, of fictional characters, James Bond and Jack Reacher, a la the new television series, Jack Reacher. Can you talk a little bit about the comparison of the behavior of the characters? In a thriller that has nothing to do with being green, right? It's about espionage and spies and murder and.
It's such a great example. So it's a project I'm doing at the moment. So if any of your listeners go #climate characters with a capital C on climate and character, no break, or #hot or not, you'll see some of these Instagrams we're sharing. But we're trying to, just in a fun way, draw attention to this issue. And we're doing it by comparing James Bond with Jack Reacher.
Right.
So James Bond has got a single-use Aston Martins.
Yeah.
You've got Jack Reacher who travels everywhere by bus. You've got James Bond with his, walk-in wardrobe of luxury suits. You've got Jack Reacher who only shops in thrift shops.
Yes, recycled clothing.
So, Jack Reacher just needs one planet's worth of resources to, kill off the bad guys. But if we all live like Bond, we need 20 planets.
I love that. I'm going to share that links to that in the show notes, and obviously go search that out on social media for resharing.
We've got loads more. We've got Emily in Paris, who needs her own Paris agreement to sort of house her walk-in wardrobe. This is Frankie from Grace and Frankie, who really
my God.
Yeah.
Love her.
So we just have fun with it, just to raise the question, because I think culture, everyone thinks it's government policies or switch to renewable energy that'll get us out of our mess. But I actually think it's, our values, and it's culture that tells us really what's normal, what's aspirational, what's problematic. So I think how you write your characters and their values has a very subtle effect, but, it's there for better or worse.
Oh my goodness. As I'm working on my next novel, I am thinking about ways that I can incorporate the behavior of my character to be more aware, particularly since he turns into a wolf. So he's a lot more connected to nature than most of us. Denise, thank you. Oh my God, thank you so much for that. So can you please let my listeners know where they can find out more about you and your various projects online?
Okay, so you can get me on my website, dabaden.com. You can find out about Green Stories on greenstories.org.uk. And I think I mentioned the hashtags climate characters and hashtag hot or not. Do share them, because we've attached it to a little survey to see what people think. Is it still okay to be portraying high carbon behavior as aspirational or not? Let us know what you think, because that research is going to go straight back to the scriptwriters, and they like to know where the public is on this issue.
Oh, fantastic. Denise, thanks so much for hanging out with me today.
Well, thank you for inviting me. It's been a delight, and I'd be happy to have a look at your wolf book and see if I can make any suggestions. That would be such fun.
Oh, that would be. Thank you again.
All right, take care, Mark.
So a couple things to reflect on. The first is just the reminder of the power that you have as a writer, as a storyteller, and in such subtle ways. The subtle ways, and I never thought about this when Denise was talking about, comparing the carbon footprint of James Bond versus Jack Reacher. And I've only read one of the Reacher novels. I've read several of the books in the Hunt for Reacher series by indie author Diane Capri. Absolutely amazing. Her latest one, Bulletproof Jack, Diane had been asking me for information about Hamilton and Ancaster, Ontario. So close to where I live, and I lived in Hamilton for about a dozen years. And because she has them cross the border over at Niagara Falls, and they're in Niagara Falls, Ontario, and then they head over to Niagara-on-the-Lake, and they head over to Ancaster and Hamilton, and it was so cool. I mean, it's just so cool. I mean, I love Diane. She's an amazing writer. She's the one who got me into Jack Reacher, and it's just so cool to read about places that I know about in the fiction. Anyways, we was talking about Jack Reacher and James Bond, and so having read at least one of the Reacher novels and the television program, which is really, really a great series, you get that reminder. Yeah, he takes a bus everywhere. He doesn't even drive a vehicle. He uses secondhand clothing. So many interesting different things, and it's so subtle. Never would feel like you're being preached to, but you're watching, learning by watching, like through example. And so I've been thinking about ways that I can look at my werewolf, Michael Andrews, and just consider the things he does. So, I mean, he does not own a car. He lives in New York, so he's on foot a lot. He walks to a lot of places. Of course, he does take cabs and Ubers and things like that, but he takes the subway. And that's just, some of the small things that we can do in terms of the way he behaves. But again, it's just little things that I can look at that don't have to be preachy. And I'm just thinking about the various stories that I share. I'm even thinking about what kind of stories I can share for her anthology. And so sometimes I will write a story for an anthology and not get it out in time to send to the anthology or to the market or whatever, but sometimes I still have those stories. So that's important too. So if you were inspired by Denise, you want to write something and you missed the deadline for June, it's not the end of the world. You still have a story. And that's the thing, is stories are power, and you are power, and you have a lot of this power. And that's a really good reminder for us, just in general, obviously to make the world a better place, but in general, it's really good to remember. You've got the power. I've got the power! Will I put a clip here? Will I put an audio clip here? Only time will tell. But the second thing I want to reflect on is it comes back to the power of story and how we can be influenced by fiction. And I want to share something here it's pretty intimate. And I was thinking about it when I was listening back to this conversation with Denise. And I was adopted. My parents, both deceased. The parents who raised me, and I think of them as my parents. They were wonderful, amazing people, and I had a wonderful, spectacular life, and I wanted for nothing. But I knew that I had birth parents out there in the world, and I'd known that most of my life. There's always this wonder in the back of your head as well, where does the biology come from? And because, now I did, when I was younger, I had epilepsy, and doctors would always ask, does anyone else in the family have epilepsy? And then I just can hear my mom's voice, Mark is adopted. So they didn't know. And so I didn't really know the biological. So I was in my 20s, and I was married, and my wife and I were thinking maybe kids. And I was a little bit nervous because I didn't know if epilepsy was hereditary. I didn't know because I didn't know my birth family. I didn't know any of my lineage. But the clincher for me was two novels that I read by Canadian authors. One of them, a good friend of mine now, Robert J. Sawyer. And the other one was a Canadian author, actually a series, I think Michael Slade is a bunch of Vancouver area lawyers who wrote under the name Michael Slade. And they were thrillers, like hard-hitting, dark thrillers. And I read the book from Rob Sawyer involved a main character who had a disease that was inherited. And the reason he came up with it is he needed to have a debilitating disease where a man in his 30s had to fight a Nazi who was in his 80s. And they needed to be equal in terms of their ability, their physical abilities. And so he had a degenerative disease that he inherited. And that was a major part of the plot, of course. But that was just Rob having explained at an author event I was at about why he gave him that disease. And that was sort of a thing about heredity. And I was like, and there was a scene with eye color and people in a classroom, and then one person realizing that the person he thought was his father was not his father. Had just been married to his mother, and his father was a different person. So that kind of stuck with me, that heredity notion and the debilitating disease. And then in the Michael Slade thriller, there was a very critical element of the mystery that was solved that had to do with heredity, and it had to do with blood relations and stuff like that. And so in the space of just a few months, both of those novels, reading those novels, entertainment, science fiction, and thriller, inspired a significant life change for me, or an important thing I did in my life, because it was shortly after that I started thinking a lot about my heredity and having a kid. And that's when I started to look for my birth family. That was it. It was reading a couple of novels, and it was elements in the novels. And again, these novels weren't about adoption, and they weren't about birth, like looking for your birth family. But they were about important elements of heredity that made me think and put me in a place where I did something very positive. I got to know my birth family and learned that I had a full sister and wonderful, amazing people. And I got to meet my birth father before he died, and he was an amazing man as well. And my birth mother is still alive, and she is a most amazing, wonderful, loving woman. And I am such a richer person for the experiences I've had, getting to know my birth parents, getting to know my sister and my 7 other siblings, both from either father and mother, the siblings that I have. Again, I'm a much, much richer person. I have a much richer life. And I already had a pretty rich life to begin with. But I have that life because I made a change, because I did something positive. And I did it because of something I read in fiction that made me think and inspired me. And that's what Denise is talking about. She's talking about those little things, those little elements in your books that can have such a tremendous and powerful difference and can help you with positive differences. And again, a reminder, you, dear writer, you have this power to change lives, to change this world for the better. Isn't that magnificent? And isn't Denise magnificent for reminding us that you have the power? Don't worry, I'm not going to play the audio clip again. But that's it for the reflection. Thank you so much for listening. I hope you learned and reflected and leaned in and had a great time with this conversation with Denise. If there are things that she talked about that you would like to reflect on, please leave the reflection over at starkreflections.ca for episode 304. And I want to say a huge thank you to everyone listening to the podcast. You can support this podcast either at starkreflections.ca or patreon.com/starkreflections. You can leave a review for the podcast anywhere you listen to podcasts, or you can share this episode or any episode of the podcast with someone that you think would find value in it. So again, thank you for listening. Again, this is Mark Leslie Lefebvre. And again, until next week and next episode, I would love to wish you great writing and good Stark Reflections.
Thank you for listening to the Stark Reflections podcast. You can find show notes for each episode at starkreflections.ca.
The music for this podcast, Laser Groove, was composed and produced by Kevin MacLeod. Check out more of Kevin's great music at incomtech.com. Ah, snap. I said I wasn't going to play the audio again, and look at that, I did. Ugh. What are you going to do? Well, here's what I hope you're going to do, dear listener. Use that as a reminder to yourself that you've got the power, dear writer.